In a small Pennsylvania town, the ground breathes smoke in January, cracks in the road glow orange at night, and the air smells like something ancient burning alive from below. This isn't a ghost story, it's much worse. What happened in Centralia wasn't just an accident. It was a decision, and by the end of this video, you're going to ask yourself one question: who really let it burn? Stay with me. In a small Pennsylvania town, the ground itself appears to breathe out smoke. Even in January, the earth under your feet stays warm to the touch. At night, cracks in the road glow with a faint orange light, and the air carries that sharp, mineral smell of something ancient feeding on itself from deep below. Something that should have been put out decades ago, but never was. Not because nobody tried, but because certain men with offices, titles, and access to documents never meant for the public, decided that whatever was burning beneath Centralia was worth more alive than dead. The official story says it began with a simple garbage fire back in May of 1962. A stupid accident. They were burning refuse in an old strip mine pit that sat right above one of the biggest networks of underground anthracite coal seams in the eastern United States. The fire was lit, the garbage burned, and then, according to the official version, the fire was thought to be out. An accident, a miscalculation. Just one of those things that happens. But if you actually talk to the people who lived in Centralia, the ones who fled years before the government finally told them they had to, the ones whose kids developed breathing problems doctors couldn't explain, the ones whose homes cracked and sank while local officials kept saying nothing was structurally wrong, you start to hear a very different account. A story about a fire that was made possible by decisions taken long before anyone struck a match. About a company that had detailed engineering reports on the underground geology beneath Centralia, reports that identified the dump site as a specific risk for fire spreading into the coal seam. Those reports were given to the state government more than a year before the fire even started. About state officials who failed to act, or were advised not to act, during the years when something could still have been done. And about a decision made somewhere by someone, that a community of several thousand people living above a growing underground furnace was a problem to be managed, not solved. This is not a ghost story. There's nothing supernatural about what happened in Centralia, and that's exactly what makes it so deeply, persistently disturbing. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt that the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you were told, if you've ever wondered what institutions will sacrifice to protect themselves when truth starts burning its way to the surface, make sure you subscribe to the Fear Sermon. Hit that notification bell so you never miss one of these deep dives into America's hidden histories. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. Because what happened in Centralia didn't really begin in 1962. It started nearly 100 years earlier, deep in the mountains, where men went underground and learned things about the earth that the earth would rather have kept to itself. To understand Centralia, you have to understand what anthracite coal meant to the people of central Pennsylvania in the late 1800s. It wasn't just fuel, it was life itself, the material that built entire communities, the reason dozens of small towns existed in the valleys and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. Unlike the softer bituminous coal found elsewhere, anthracite burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. It was the coal that heated the brownstones of New York and the townhouses of Philadelphia. It powered the factories of the Gilded Age and made possible the industrial capitalism that reshaped America after the Civil War. And the men who controlled the rights to pull it from the ground became extraordinarily powerful. The region that would become Columbia County sat on top of one of the most remarkable geological formations in North America, a massive anthracite deposit running in thick, connected veins through the ridges and hollows. Those veins had been worked for generations. Small, independent mining operations had opened shafts and dug tunnels throughout the area in the early 1800s, pulling coal by hand and mule, leaving behind a maze of tunnels and chambers that was never fully mapped. When the big coal companies arrived after the Civil War and started systematic extraction, they inherited not just the coal but also that underground labyrinth, all its passages, chambers, intersections, flooded sections, gassy areas, sealed entries, and rotting timber supports. Centralia was incorporated in 1866. Though settlers had been in the valley for decades before, the town sat in a natural bowl between ridges, a tight grid of streets pressed close together, the way coal country towns always were, as if proximity itself might offer some protection against the loneliness of the mountains. By the 1870s, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company had started major operations in the area, and the network of tunnels beneath Centralia's streets grew more extensive every year. The miners who worked those tunnels knew them like the floors of their own homes. Which passages connected where, which ceilings were low, where the air went bad in wet weather, which shafts had been abandoned and sealed with nothing but a few timbers and a pile of ash and dirt. Most of those miners were immigrants, Welsh, Irish, Lithuanian, Polish, Slovak, Italian. They'd come because the companies recruited them, sending agents to the ports with promises of steady wages and company housing. And they'd stayed because the coal had swallowed their fathers and brothers and neighbors, and because the coal region was all they knew. They built churches in Centralia, half a dozen denominations packed into a town that at its peak held about 2,000 souls. They built a school, a post office, a movie theater, taverns, a lunch counter, a hardware store. They built a real community, a place with its own texture and memory, on ground that was never fully theirs. One miner, Joseph Cudlack, who worked the Locust Run shaft starting in 1898 until a roof collapse took two of his fingers in 1911, kept a journal that his granddaughter later donated to a small archive in Bloomsburg. In an entry from the summer of 1903, he wrote something that would read like prophecy decades later. The foreman told them again to leave a certain tunnel sealed and ask no questions about it. He said the gas in there was bad, but Cudlack had been to the entrance and he couldn't detect any bad air. Just old coal and empty darkness, and the sense that whatever was wrong in that place, the company already knew and wasn't going to share. What Cudlack sensed, but couldn't put into technical words, was that the geological map beneath Centralia was more complex and dangerous than the company had ever disclosed to the miners or the town. Above, the coal veins ran not just deep but shallow, in some places less than 50 feet beneath the streets and yards. And those shallow seams connected to deeper ones through the old workings left by generations of small-scale mining. The ground beneath Centralia was full of holes, interconnected, partially sealed, partially flooded, partially filled with gases. A vast underground architecture that no single person had ever fully mapped. For decades, that just meant living in Centralia came with a certain background unease. The occasional sinkhole cracking a foundation, the sulfur smell rising from certain yards in wet weather. The mine foremen who discouraged questions and kept their own counsel. People adapted. People in coal country had learned across generations to live with things that would be considered unbearable anywhere else. That was just part of life there, a certain toughness, a certain silence about what was simply the condition of your existence. And then in the spring of 1962, someone lit a match. The official account of May 27, 1962, is almost boring. Members of the Centralia Borough Council authorized burning the town's garbage dump, as they'd done before without incident. The dump was in an old strip mine pit at the edge of town on Langdon Street, a shallow hole used for waste for some time. Nothing special, the fire was set, the garbage burned, and by all appearances, the fire was out when they finished. The council members went home, the borough went about its business. Over the following days, workers noticed some parts of the dump were still smoldering. They poured water, they covered the hot spots with soil. They came back the next day, and the smoldering continued. This wasn't treated as unusual at first. Dump fires sometimes lingered, and the usual fixes usually worked within a few days. What no one on the borough council knew, and what the state agency responsible for mine safety almost certainly did know, was that the Langdon Street dump had been built in a location with a specific, documented risk. An engineering report commissioned in April of 1961, more than a year before the fire, by the company holding the mineral rights beneath Centralia, had identified the dump site as sitting right next to, and in some spots directly above, unmapped old workings that connected to the main coal seam network. That report noted, in careful technical language, that burning operations at the dump should be done under supervision because of the risk of fire spreading into the coal below. That report had been submitted to the state government. It was sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere in Harrisburg, while the borough council voted to burn the dump in May of 1962. Nobody told the borough council. Nobody sent a memo or made a phone call or posted a notice. Nobody pulled that engineering file and said, "Wait, this location has been flagged as a risk." And so the fire found the coal, not dramatically, not with an explosion or some visible catastrophe that would have demanded an immediate response, but slowly, invisibly, the way underground fires always begin. A thin, unmapped seam along the edge of the pit. The fire followed the seam, that seam connected to others. The old workings gave it a path. The fire moved. Coal seam fires aren't like surface fires. They don't roar. They don't put on a show. They smolder at temperatures over 1,000 degrees while the ground above looks, to the casual eye, mostly normal. They follow the seams wherever they lead, through the dark, through old tunnels, through that complex underground geography no surface map fully captures. And once they get established in a seam system, they're incredibly hard to put out, especially when that system is as big and poorly mapped as the one beneath Centralia. In the weeks and months after the May fire, state mine inspectors visited the dump and filed reports. They noted ongoing underground burning. They noted that the usual suppression methods weren't working. They noted that the fire seemed to be spreading beyond the dump pit. And then, for a period that would later get a lot of scrutiny, no decisive action came. The reasons for that inaction bring us to the part of the Centralia story that official histories tend to blame on bureaucratic inefficiency, coordination failures, budget problems, the difficulty of responding to something unprecedented. Those explanations aren't entirely wrong. They're just incomplete. In 1962, Pennsylvania's coal industry was in managed decline. The great anthracite companies had mostly finished mining the easiest seams, and had shifted to protecting and making money from whatever coal remained underground. The mineral rights beneath Centralia, the legal ownership of the coal still in the ground, were held by a corporate successor to one of the original mining companies, now part of a larger energy conglomerate based in Philadelphia. Those rights had value even for coal that wasn't currently accessible. In an era of energy uncertainty, the future possibility of mining those seams was worth something to the men who held the rights, and the value of those rights was directly affected by what happened on the surface above them. Several of the men in positions to respond quickly to the Centralia fire had professional histories, and in some cases ongoing relationships, with the coal industry they were supposed to be regulating. This wasn't unusual in Pennsylvania at the time. The revolving door between industry and the agencies overseeing it wasn't a secret. It was just the established order, the way things had worked for decades in a state where coal was king, and the people who ran coal were woven through government and civic life at every level. Putting out the fire in its early stages would have meant digging up the affected dump area, removing the burning material, and sealing the seam entry points to stop reignition. Early engineering estimates put the cost somewhere between $175,000 and $400,000, significant but not catastrophic. Not the kind of expense that should have been hard to justify when the alternative was letting a fire spread through the underground seam network beneath a town full of people. The state hesitated, federal agencies were consulted, a working group was formed, studies were commissioned. More time passed. By 1965, 3 years after the initial fire, the underground burning had moved well beyond the dump site. Engineers who examined the area that year used language like significant expansion and continued spread into the township, and immediate intervention needed. One man, Harold Trezise, submitted a formal report that autumn, noting specifically that the fire front had reached a point where it was about to become uncontainable if action wasn't taken very soon. That report sat in a filing cabinet in Harrisburg for nearly a year. By the time money was finally allocated for a real suppression attempt, a trenching operation meant to cut off the fire's path, the fire had already moved around and beyond the trench before the work was even finished. The first major federal intervention came in 1969. By then, the fire had been burning for 7 years. It had spread through multiple seams and put itself in a position where putting it out would require an effort so massive and expensive that neither the state nor the federal government was willing to commit. What had been a containable local problem in 1962 was by 1969 a catastrophe moving in slow motion. Centralia's surface was still intact, the houses were still standing, the school was still open. Kids still walked to church on Sunday mornings along streets that, from above, looked mostly like they always had. But below, in the dark, the fire was moving through the seams with the patience of something that didn't need to hurry. The people of Centralia didn't know the full extent of what was moving beneath them. They would spend the next decade and a half finding out, one frightening discovery at a time. There's a tendency in retellings of Centralia to focus on the institutional failures, the documents filed and ignored, the reports written and shelved, the agencies that studied while the fire spread. That focus is fair, but it risks missing something equally important, what it was actually like to live in Centralia during those years between the fire's start and the evacuation's end. The answer, in ways that are both ordinary and heartbreaking, is that life in Centralia during that time was recognizable. People went to work, kids went to school, the churches held services and suppers and annual fairs. The remaining stores stayed open as long as they could. Neighbors visited neighbors. People argued at borough council meetings about exactly the kinds of things people argue about everywhere: road maintenance, budget allocations, the usual frustrations of local government. All of this continued, with varying degrees of normalcy, above a fire that was slowly making the ground they stood on unlivable. A teacher named Margaret Petrosky, who taught at Centralia's school from 1958 until it was consolidated with a neighboring district in 1982, gave an oral history to a researcher from Penn State in 1989. She described those years with a precision that sounds like something she'd thought through carefully over a long time. She said the strange thing was how ordinary most days were. You'd come in the morning, teach, the kids would be there, you'd go home. And then sometimes something would remind you, a crack in the road that wasn't there the week before. Or a smell in the lower hallway you couldn't get rid of no matter what. Or a kid coming in and telling you their mother had been sick again. And you'd think, how is this ordinary? How have we made this ordinary? But we did. People do. What Petrosky described, that accommodation of the extraordinary within the framework of the ordinary, is a known psychological response to chronic environmental threat. When people can't immediately remove themselves from a dangerous situation, they develop a form of normalization that lets daily life continue. It's not exactly denial. Centralia's residents weren't unaware of the fire, they were acutely aware. But awareness without the ability to act eventually settles into a kind of background hum, so daily life continued because it had to. Because the alternative was paralysis. Because the kids still needed to be fed and the bills paid and the furnace coaxed to life on February mornings, even if that furnace sat in a basement that was noticeably warmer than it should have been. The social life of the town during those years had a quality survivors describe with striking consistency, a heightened intensity of community connection alongside a growing sense that nothing was permanent. People came together in churches and the remaining taverns and each other's kitchens with an awareness, often unspoken, that what they were maintaining together was fragile in ways communities built on solid ground never had to face. Birthday parties and baptisms and Sunday dinners took on extra weight. Arguments about small things, the kind that fill any community's life, had a different quality in Centralia then, because everyone involved understood at some level that the community they were arguing within might not be there much longer in the same form. Father Bernard Cherney, who served as pastor of one of Centralia's Catholic parishes from 1971 through the final years of the evacuation, described his experience in a memoir published privately and available in the Bloomsburg Historical Collection. He wrote that he had been present at many deathbeds in his ministry, and he recognized that what he witnessed in Centralia during those years was structurally similar. The particular quality of time that belongs to a life that knows its ending, where each ordinary moment carries a weight it wouldn't have in circumstances of permanence. People in Centralia during those years loved their community with an unusual fierceness and fought for it with an unusual tenacity. And when they finally had to leave, the grief was of a kind he hadn't encountered before. Not the grief of losing someone you love, but the grief of a community that had been robbed of the future it should have had. By the mid-1970s, Centralia had already begun to change in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to miss if you'd known the town before. The population was dropping steadily. Young people left after high school and didn't come back. Families who could afford to move quietly did. The storefronts on Center Street emptied one by one. The hardware store closed. The movie house closed. The lunch counter cut its hours and then its ambitions. The fire made itself known in different ways in different parts of town. In some yards, patches of grass dyed brown ovals in otherwise green lawns. The soil beneath them warmed to the touch in December when the ground should have been frozen solid. In some basements, a smell collected in corners and along floor joists, sulfurous, mineral, the smell of something old burning deep down. Carbon monoxide, colorless and odorless, built up in enclosed spaces at levels that gave people headaches and slowed their thinking and made the air feel thick and wrong in ways hard to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. In at least a handful of cases in the documentary record, people lost consciousness in their own homes. A physician named Dr. Raymond Solke, who grew up in a neighboring town and maintained a practice serving the coal region for years, began noticing patterns among his Centralia patients in the early 1970s that troubled him deeply. He documented higher rates of respiratory illness among residents of certain blocks, illness that didn't respond normally to standard treatment and seemed linked to how long they'd lived there rather than individual health history. He documented neurological symptoms consistent with long-term, low-level carbon monoxide exposure. Fatigue, persistent headaches, mental fog that people described as an ongoing fogginess, mood changes in people with no prior history of such problems. In one section of town that sat above where the fire had been active longest, he documented a pattern of pregnancy complications he couldn't attribute to anything other than the air quality in that neighborhood. Dr. Solke sent his findings to the Pennsylvania Department of Health in 1977. He got an acknowledgement letter. He sent a follow-up with more documentation in 1979. He got another acknowledgement letter. In a letter to a colleague in March of 1980, he described his frustration with striking precision. He wrote that he had come to understand that the people of that community were, in the calculus of whoever was making these decisions, an acceptable loss. Not in any policy document, nothing written explicitly, but in the pattern of what happened to every request for action. It was studied, the study generated recommendations, the recommendations generated more study, and the families living above the fire breathed the air and waited for something to change. This story of Walter Gasparetti puts a human face on that abstraction. Walter was born in Centralia in 1931, the son of an Italian immigrant miner who'd come to the coal region before World War I and never left. Walter grew up in the town, married a woman named Rose Brennan, whose people had been in the valley since the 1880s, and spent his working life as a plumber serving the local community. He knew the town the way you can only know a place you've lived in for a lifetime. Every house, every basement, every furnace that needed coaxing in February. He was, by any measure, a man who understood his environment. In 1973, Walter noticed his basement was warmer than it should be. Not alarming at first, but distinctly, persistently warmer in a way that didn't match any obvious mechanical explanation. He installed a carbon monoxide detector on the advice of a neighbor who worked with the mine rescue service and had started quietly telling people to take precautions. The detector went off several times in the early morning hours when the house was closed up. Walter went to the borough council. He wrote to the state office in Bloomsburg. He sent a letter to the Department of Environmental Resources in Harrisburg. He was told the situation was being monitored. He was told his readings were within parameters under review. He was told in the bureaucratic language designed to sound attentive while promising nothing, that the appropriate agencies were aware of his concerns. In the winter of 1976, Rose Gasparetti found her husband on the floor of his basement unresponsive. He had gone down to check a pipe. When help arrived and the basement was ventilated and measurements were taken, the carbon monoxide level in that space was about 3 times what the state's own standards said was immediately dangerous to human life. Walter survived. The damage to his heart and lungs was not reversible. When Rose testified before a state legislative committee in 1983, 7 years later, by which point Centralia's evacuation was well underway, she brought the letters. She had kept every letter Walter had written to every agency and every form response they'd sent back. She spread the papers on the table in front of the committee members. Years of correspondence. A documentary record of a man who had tried every channel available to him to say that something was wrong beneath his home, and who had received in return a succession of letters that acknowledged his concern without acting on it. She said quietly, he knew for years before it nearly killed him. Every person he contacted, every official, every agency, they knew too. What I want answered is not why the fire is still burning. What I want answered is why they let it burn. The committee received her testimony. A report was issued. Recommendations were made. The fire kept burning. By 1981, the fire had been going for nearly 2 decades. The state had acknowledged it, had tried several suppression operations that the fire had gotten around, had commissioned studies and formed committees and allocated funds that were spent without achieving what they were supposed to achieve. The residents who remained had developed the particular psychology of people living with a chronic, unresolved danger, a mix of adaptation and vigilance, of normalizing things that shouldn't be normal, and then, on the morning of February 14, 1981, the fire introduced itself in a way that could no longer be explained away or filed in a cabinet. Todd Domboski was 12 years old. He was playing in his grandmother's backyard on Locust Avenue, a cold winter morning with snow on the ground. Wisps of steam, rising from certain spots in the yard, were a familiar sight. People on that block had gotten used to them, had stopped remarking on them, had absorbed them into their understanding of what their neighborhood looked like in winter. Todd walked across a patch of ground that looked, as far as he could tell, exactly like the ground around it. The earth gave way beneath him. A sinkhole opened without warning. The surface layer of soil, dried out and weakened by the heat and gases rising from below, simply collapsed under the weight of a 12-year-old boy. The hole that opened was about 4 feet across. It quickly got deeper as loose material at the edges kept falling in. The final depth was later estimated somewhere between 50 and 150 feet. From the darkness below, carbon monoxide and heat rose in a column that was immediately visible as a rush of warm, foul air against the February cold. Todd survived because his cousin Dennis was nearby and grabbed him immediately, gripping his arm while Todd hung in the opening and the earth kept crumbling around them, making the hole wider. Others came and helped pull him out, The gas exposure was serious enough to require medical attention. If Todd had been alone, if his cousin hadn't been so close, if the hole had been another foot wider when Dennis grabbed for him, he would have died. The carbon monoxide levels in the gases rising from below, measured shortly after, were high enough to make a person unconscious in minutes and dead in 15. Photographs of the hole circulated nationally. The image was stark and undeniable. A gap in an ordinary backyard, steam rising from the darkness below, the edge of a snowy lawn crumbling at the rim. Congressional representatives demanded briefings. Journalists who had been covering Centralia for years finally had a picture that needed no explanation. A 12-year-old boy had nearly disappeared into the burning ground on Valentine's Day, and that photograph was something institutions couldn't produce a study group to manage. The evacuation process, which would unfold over the next decade, was set in motion by a 12-year-old going outside to play on a winter morning and finding that the ground where he stood wasn't what it seemed. That's one of the precise, specific ironies of Centralia. The moment of maximum visibility was also the most personal, the most human, the hardest to turn into an abstraction. Not a graph of underground temperatures, not an engineering report, a child, a hole, a cousin close enough to grab his arm. In the spring of 1997, a doctoral candidate at Penn State working on a dissertation about mid-century coal regulation made a discovery in the state archives in Harrisburg that stopped him cold. His name was Michael Fury. He was researching the regulatory framework for strip mining in the post-war period and had been working through a large, poorly organized collection of files from the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, the predecessor to the Department of Environmental Resources. The collection covered decades of regulatory activity and hadn't been systematically reviewed since it was first deposited. Near the back of one filing cabinet, misfiled under a heading for Schuylkill County instead of Columbia County, Fury found a folder containing documents dated 1961 and 1962. Engineering reports prepared by a consulting firm working for the company that held the mineral rights to the coal seams beneath Centralia. Detailed, technical, precise. They described the underground geology of the area with a thoroughness that made clear the company had invested serious resources in understanding what lay beneath the town. One section of those reports addressed the Langdon Street dump site specifically. The language was careful, the language of engineers who knew they were producing a document that might one day be reviewed by lawyers, but the substance was unmistakable. The dump occupied a former strip mine pit. That pit was adjacent to, and in several places directly above, a series of old workings that connected to the main seam network beneath the township. Any burning operations at this site should be done with specific precautions and under qualified supervision, given the risk of fire spreading to the underlying coal formations. The report was dated April 1961, more than a year before the fire. Fury sat in the archive reading room for a long time after he understood what he was looking at. He read through the documents again. He saw the state agency filing code on the folder, which meant it had been received and logged by the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries. Received, logged, filed, and then apparently never acted upon in any way that stopped the Borough Council from burning the same dump site 14 months later. The Borough Council had no access to those mineral rights reports. They were a local governing body making a routine decision. They didn't know an engineering firm had told the state government more than a year earlier that burning at Langdon Street posed a specific, identifiable risk. They couldn't have known that information was in the wrong room, in the wrong cabinet, in the wrong folder, in an archive 60 miles away. Fury contacted the State Archives Administration. He contacted a historian at Bloomsburg University who had written about Centralia. He contacted a journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer who had covered the story extensively in the 1980s. The journalist made inquiries. She contacted the Department of Environmental Resources, the State Attorney General's office, and the corporate successor to the company that had commissioned the 1961 reports. The state's response was that the documents were historical materials outside any applicable statute of limitations. The corporate successor's response was that its legal team had reviewed the matter and had no comment on historical documents. The Attorney General's office said no investigation was warranted based on the information provided. The documents were described in a sidebar article in the Inquirer in 1998. It ran on page B7. There was no follow-up investigation, no legislative hearing, no formal inquiry into how an engineering report identifying a specific fire risk at a specific location had been received by the state and then filed without any action to prevent the risk it described. The fire beneath Centralia was still burning when that article ran. It is still burning now. The emptying of Centralia didn't happen in the swift, decisive way of emergency evacuations. It happened the way slow catastrophes always resolve, unevenly, incompletely, with the people most affected carrying the weight of decisions made at a distance by institutions that would not be living with the consequences. Federal relocation money started arriving in 1984, after years of congressional attention and the persistent advocacy of a small group of residents who had by then become practiced navigators of government response. Families began accepting buyout offers. Some left with relief, grateful for any resolution to a situation that had been unresolved for more than 20 years. Some left with fury, the controlled anger of people who understood they were being compensated for something that should never have happened at all. Some held out for better terms, arguing with federal agents over property valuations in kitchens where carbon monoxide detectors had been sounding for years. And a few simply refused. Refused on principle, or from necessity, or from that deep human unwillingness to accept that the life you've built and the place where you've buried your dead will simply be bought out from under you at a price set by the people responsible for the situation in the first place. A woman named Elinor Whiteshek, whose family had been in Centralia for 3 generations, refused the first 2 buyout offers and stayed on Locust Avenue until 1992. She had raised her children in that house. She had buried her husband from the church 2 blocks away. She had worked for decades at the lunch counter that closed when the grocery store closed, when the hardware store closed. She knew the town in the intimate, accumulated way that only long habitation makes possible. In an interview with a Bloomsburg newspaper shortly before she finally accepted relocation, she said, "They keep telling us the town is finished. But who decided that? Who decided when we were done? It wasn't us. We didn't decide to have the dump where it was. We didn't decide how the state responded. We didn't decide any of this. We were just here. And now they want to pay us for what was ours and call it settled." Her words carried something beyond personal grievance, because she was right in a precise and documentable way. The people of Centralia had not decided to build a garbage dump on ground above unmapped mine workings. They had not decided to have the state in possession of an engineering report, identifying the dump as a fire risk without acting on it. They had not decided to have officials who delayed intervention through the years when the fire was still containable. Those decisions had been made for them by systems and institutions operating with interests and information that Centralia's residents did not share and were not told about. By 1992, the town's population had fallen below 100. By 2000, it was fewer than 20. The zip code 17,927 was discontinued by the U.S. Postal Service in 2002, a bureaucratic confirmation that the town, for official purposes, no longer existed. The street signs were removed. The roads that had served the departed neighborhoods were torn up. The property taken through eminent domain was left to whatever slow reclamation the vegetation and the elements and the heat rising from below would perform. The church where Father Cherney had ministered through the crisis, St. Ignatius on Wood Street, was one of the last buildings to be demolished. The former congregation, scattered across multiple communities in the region, had kept a connection to the building long after most of its members had left Centralia. When demolition finally came, people drove for hours to be there, to stand on the sidewalk outside the church where they had been baptized and confirmed and married, where they had buried their dead, and watch it come down. The ground beneath them, even then, was warm. Just when we thought we understood the full picture of what happened in Centralia, just when the scale of the loss seemed fully established, new questions surfaced about what the fire was still doing, and what some people may have always wanted it to do. There is a question that runs beneath every account of Centralia, beneath the official histories, the journalistic investigations, the academic analyses, beneath all the documents reviewed and all the testimonies recorded. It is a question none of the official investigations has ever fully answered. A question the people who lived in Centralia asked themselves and asked the men in offices and agencies who came to meet with them and take notes and produce reports, and never received a satisfying response to. The question is this: who benefited from the fire continuing to burn? To answer it, you have to think about the underground differently than the official story encourages. The coal seams beneath Centralia still contained substantial amounts of anthracite when the fire started in 1962. The most accessible seams had been worked, but there were deeper and more extensive deposits that the technology and economics of mid-century extraction had left in place. Those deposits, the mineral rights to that coal, were held by corporate entities that by the early 1960s were subsidiaries of larger energy conglomerates. The value of those rights was real, even for coal that wasn't currently accessible. In an era of uncertain energy economics and an uncertain future for coal, the holders of mineral rights beneath an inhabited community sat on an asset whose development was complicated by the people living above it. You cannot strip mine beneath a community. You cannot excavate the shallow seams under a residential neighborhood without moving the residents above. The legal and political obstacles to large-scale surface disruption of an inhabited area are enormous. Eminent domain proceedings, community opposition, media attention, the full weight of a community's claim to the ground it has occupied for generations. Those obstacles aren't insurmountable, but they are costly. They take time, they create scrutiny. They produce the kind of public conflict companies and the officials connected to them prefer to avoid. But a fire changes the math, a fire that makes the surface uninhabitable, that causes the government to declare the ground above the coal too dangerous for human presence, to buy out the residents, to demolish the buildings, to retire the zip code. A fire that does all of that removes the obstacles. It clears the surface. It empties the land of the legal and moral complexity that inhabited land carries. It turns a town into a depopulated zone, where the only remaining question is the industrial one. No document has ever surfaced explicitly stating that the fire was allowed or encouraged to spread as a strategy for clearing the surface above a coal deposit. The historical record does not support a claim of deliberate arson or conscious conspiracy to that specific effect. What the historical record does support, with considerable documentation, is a pattern of decisions, each individually explainable by its own institutional logic, that had the cumulative effect of letting the fire grow from a containable local problem into a catastrophe that ultimately emptied an entire community. The 1961 engineering report, filed and ignored, the years of delayed intervention while the fire moved from the dump into the seam network, the suppression operations that were underfunded and ineffective, the decade and a half during which families lived above the expanding fire while agencies studied and committees met and reports were issued and filed, the documents that sat in the wrong cabinet in the Harrisburg archive for 36 years. Each of these things, taken alone, can be blamed on ordinary institutional failure, bureaucratic inertia, budget constraints, the normal friction of government response to something unprecedented. But the pattern of them, the particular way failure accumulated at every stage where success was still possible, and then the particular way the aftermath of that failure served certain interests, Very well. That pattern is harder to chalk up to simple incompetence. The people who built Centralia and worked the mines and raised their children above the seams did not have the power to shape that pattern. They had the power to write letters and attend hearings and testify before committees and bring their correspondence and spread it on tables in front of the men who had failed them and ask, very quietly and very specifically, "Why did you let it burn?" None of those men ever gave a satisfying answer. Geologists who have modeled the Centralia fire estimate that, based on the volume of coal still in the affected seams and the historical rate of consumption, the fire could burn for another 100 to 250 years from today. There are children alive right now who will not live to see the Centralia fire go out. They will grow up, grow old, build lives, and the fire will still be there when they are gone, burning in the dark beneath the hills of Columbia County, patient in the way geological processes are, patient, indifferent to everything that has happened on the surface above it. The town itself is a kind of ghost, not in the supernatural sense, but in the very real, very physical sense of a place that exists in official documentation without existing on the ground. The street grid is still visible from the air, the intersections, the block patterns, the lots where houses stood before the demolition crews came. The vegetation has worked its way through the old foundations. The cemetery is still there, its stones still standing above ground that is warm to the touch, steam rising on cold mornings through the grass between the grave markers. A small number of people, fewer than 10 by the most recent available counts, remain. They live under an agreement with the state. They may stay in their homes for the rest of their lives, after which the properties go back to the Commonwealth. It is, depending on your perspective, either a recognition of something that could not be taken from them, or the final act in a very long process of managed erasure. The last people standing on ground the state has already declared does not exist as a community. If you walk through what remains of Centralia on a cold morning, and people do walk there, drawn by the strangeness of it, by the steam rising from earth that should be frozen by the snow, free patches on the hillsides where the heat below keeps the ground clear. You can feel the warmth through the soles of your boots. You can smell it, that mineral ancient smell of coal burning deep and slow. The earth beneath you is alive in a way that has nothing human about it. And yet, it is entirely the product of human decisions. Every degree of warmth in that ground, every wisp of steam, every crack in what used to be a road, the result of choices made by specific people in specific offices, for reasons that were never fully disclosed to the people who lived above. Elinor Wojtaszek is gone. Walter Gasparetti is gone. Dr. Raymond Solke is gone. Harold Trezise, who filed the 1965 report that sat in a cabinet for a year, is almost certainly gone. The men who received the 1961 engineering report and did nothing with it are gone. The lawyers who reviewed the liability exposure and advised their clients accordingly are gone. The fire remains. And somewhere in the archives of the Commonwealth, in the collections no dissertation student has happened to look through yet, in the files that were correctly filed and have therefore attracted no special attention, and in the boxes that were sealed when certain departments were reorganized and haven't been opened since, there may be documents that would tell us more precisely what was known, and when, and what was decided. Documents that would put names and dates and institutional affiliations to the pattern of decisions that turned a garbage fire into a 60-year catastrophe. We don't have those documents. We have what the record has given us, the 1961 report, the delayed suppression attempts, the letters Walter Gasparetti sent and the form responses he received, Rose Gasparetti's testimony, and the pile of correspondence she laid on the table before the Legislative Committee. The sidebar on page B7 of the Philadelphia Inquirer. The children who grew up breathing the air of a town that was burning from below, whose health history was documented by a physician who could not get the state to investigate his findings. We have the ground itself, warm in January, steaming in winter cold, cracked in ways that tell the story of what burns below, indifferent to every administrative decision made above it. This is what Centralia shows us, that the most consequential disasters are rarely simple. They are the product of accumulated decisions made by systems that rarely face consequences for their choices, affecting communities that had no say in the decisions that shaped their fate. The fire in Centralia is geological now, beyond human intervention at any reasonable scale, but the fire's history is human, thoroughly and specifically human, and the record of it has never been fully reckoned with. What do you think? Do you believe the full truth of what happened in Centralia has ever been told? Do you think the people who made those decisions, the ones who received that report in 1961 and filed it, the ones who read Trezis's 1965 report and sat on it for a year, the ones who got Walter Gasparotti's letters and sent form responses, do you think any of them understood in those moments what they were setting in motion? Drop your comment below. We read every single one, and your thoughts genuinely shape where we take these stories next. If this kind of deep historical investigation is what you came to the Fear Sermon for, the stories institutions prefer to leave buried, make sure you subscribe. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next story is already waiting, and the ground beneath it, as always, is warmer than it should be.